The morning sun cast long shadows across Heathrow Airport as Camilla Parker Bowles hurried through the VIP terminal, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She clutched her boarding pass tightly, the paper slightly crumpled from her nervous grip. Today was supposed to be different. Today, she was finally going to escape the suffocating walls of royal protocol and fly to Switzerland, where her sister Annabelle was waiting with open arms and a promise of normalcy. The past months had been unbearable. Ever since Charles had announced their engagement to the world, Camilla felt like she was drowning in a sea of expectations, photographers, and endless etiquette lessons. The palace staff treated her with polite distance, as if she were an intruder who had somehow slipped past security. Even the servants seemed to whisper behind her back, comparing her to Diana's memory at every turn. Last night, the final straw had broken. During a formal dinner with foreign dignitaries, she had accidentally used the wrong fork for the fish course. The look of horror on the Queen's face was subtle but unmistakable. Later in private, Charles had gently suggested she might benefit from more intensive training with the royal protocol officer. The way he said it, so carefully and diplomatically, made her feel like a project that needed fixing rather than the woman he claimed to love. So she had made her decision. While Charles was away on a 3-day tour of Scotland, she would slip away to Switzerland. Just for a week, maybe 2. Time to breathe. To remember who she was before she became a future queen. Her sister had been begging her to visit the small chalet they had inherited from their grandmother. High in the Alps where paparazzi couldn't follow, Camilla had packed carefully, choosing clothes that made her feel like herself again. Comfortable sweaters, riding boots, and the pearl necklace her father had given her on her 18th birthday. She had even brought her beloved dog-eared copy of Jane Austen novels, something that always brought her comfort during difficult times. The flight was scheduled to depart in 45 minutes. She had timed everything perfectly, knowing that Charles wouldn't discover her absence until evening, when he would expect her to call from Clarence House. By then, she would be safely tucked away in the mountains, watching the sunset paint the snow-capped peaks golden pink. As she approached the gate, Camilla felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since becoming engaged to the future King of England, she felt like she could breathe properly. The weight of the crown, even though she had never actually worn one, seemed to lift from her shoulders with each step toward the boarding gate. She thought about calling Annabelle to confirm her arrival time, but decided against it. The surprise would make her sister's day. They had always been close, sharing secrets and dreams since childhood. Annabelle was the only person who could make Camilla laugh until her sides hurt. The only one who remembered the girl she used to be before titles and responsibilities changed everything. The departure board showed her flight on time. Gate 23. She quickened her pace, pulling her small-wheeled suitcase behind her. In her handbag, she carried enough cash to last several weeks, having learned from royal security briefings that credit cards could be traced too easily. She had thought of everything, or so she believed. Just as she reached the security checkpoint leading to the international departures area, Camilla noticed unusual activity ahead. Several men in dark suits were speaking quietly with airport security personnel. Their posture was familiar. She had seen it countless times at royal events. These were not ordinary security officers. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. Perhaps they were here for someone else. After all, Heathrow was always full of VIPs and dignitaries. She approached the security line, fishing her passport from her handbag with hands that trembled only slightly. The moment she handed over her identification, everything changed. The security officer's eyes widened almost imperceptibly before he made a subtle gesture toward the men in suits. One of them, tall with graying temples and the bearing of a military officer, began walking directly toward her. Camilla's stomach dropped. She recognized him now. Commander Harrison, head of Royal Protection Services, the same man who had briefed her on security protocols just weeks earlier, explaining in his clipped professional tone how her life would change once she married into the royal family. How every movement would be monitored, every trip approved, every detail of her existence subject to scrutiny and control. As he approached, his expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the determination in his eyes. This was not a coincidence. This was not a chance encounter. Someone had discovered her plan, and they had sent the most senior royal protection officer to stop her. The other passengers in the security line began to notice the commotion. Whispers started, phones appeared, and Camilla realized that within minutes, photos of this encounter would be spreading across social media and landing on newspaper editors' desks around the world. Commander Harrison stopped directly in front of her, his voice low and respectful but absolutely firm when he spoke the words that would shatter her dreams of temporary freedom. "Mrs. Parker Bowles, I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me." The blood drained from Camilla's face as she stared at Commander Harrison. Around them, the busy airport seemed to slow to a crawl. Travelers continued rushing past with their luggage. Announcements echoed through the terminal, but all she could hear was the thundering of her own heartbeat. "I'm sorry, Commander, but I don't understand," she managed to say, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "I'm simply taking a holiday to visit my sister. Surely there's no security concern with a trip to Switzerland." Harrison's expression remained professional, but she caught a flicker of something that might have been sympathy in his eyes. He had daughters of his own, she remembered from their previous briefings. He understood what it meant to feel trapped, even if his duty required him to be the one doing the trapping. "Ma'am, I have direct orders from Clarence House," he said quietly, stepping closer to ensure their conversation remained private, despite the growing attention from nearby travelers. "You are to return immediately. Your luggage will need to be inspected as a security precaution." The word orders hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't even married yet, wasn't even officially part of the royal family, and already she was receiving orders. The life she had known, where she could make spontaneous decisions about her own movements, was evaporating before her eyes. "Orders from whom?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would break her heart. "His Royal Highness personally contacted us early this morning," Harrison replied. "He was quite concerned about your safety, traveling without proper security arrangements." Camilla's hands trembled as she processed this information. Charles had known. Somehow, despite her careful planning, he had discovered her intended escape. Perhaps he had called Clarence House expecting to speak with her, or maybe one of the staff had noticed her absence during the morning routine. Either way, her hope for even a brief taste of freedom was crumbling. "I see," she whispered, and in that moment she truly did see. This was her future. Every decision monitored, every movement controlled, every desire for independence seen as a security risk or an embarrassment to the crown. 2 more royal protection officers had appeared, flanking Harrison in a formation that looked casual to distant observers, but effectively blocked any escape route. They were all polite, all professional, but their message was crystal clear. She would not be boarding that flight. The departure gate for her Swiss Airlines flight was clearly visible in the distance. She could see passengers beginning to board, families hugging goodbye, business travelers checking their phones one last time. The normal world, the world she desperately wanted to rejoin, even if just for a few days. "Ma'am, if you would please come this way." Harrison gestured toward a discreet door marked Airport Authority, authorized personnel only. "We have a private room where we can handle this matter with minimal disruption." Camilla looked around at the curious faces now openly staring at their group. Several people had their phones out, undoubtedly recognizing her despite her attempt to dress down for the journey. By evening, the headlines would be screaming about the future queen's thwarted escape attempt. "And my luggage?" she asked, grasping at the last shred of dignity she could maintain. "Will be collected and thoroughly inspected, as I mentioned. Standard security protocol, you understand?" She understood perfectly. They would go through every item she had packed, every book, every photograph, every personal belonging. They would catalog and analyze her choices, looking for clues about her state of mind, her intentions, her level of commitment to her royal duties. As they walked toward the private room, Camilla caught sight of her reflection in a shop window. She looked pale and defeated, nothing like the confident woman who had stridden through the terminal just minutes earlier. The weight of her engagement ring suddenly felt enormous on her finger. Inside the small, windowless room, Harrison offered her a chair at a plain table. The space was clearly designed for situations like this: discreet, private, impossible to escape from. A royal prison disguised as an administrative office. "Mrs. Parker Bowles," Harrison began, settling into the chair across from her, "I want you to know that everyone involved in this situation has the utmost respect for your position and your feelings. However, as the future Princess of Wales and Queen Consort, Your security is of paramount importance. Future Princess of Wales. The title that Diana had once held. The title that still seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Camilla had never asked for any of this. She had simply fallen in love with a man who happened to be the heir to the British throne. When will Charles arrive? She asked, knowing instinctively that he would come personally to collect her. His Royal Highness is currently flying back from Scotland. He should arrive within the next 2 hours. 2 hours. 2 hours sitting in this sterile room while her flight departed without her. While her sister waited at the chalet wondering why she hadn't called. While her dreams of temporary freedom disappeared into the Swiss Alps she would never see. Through the small window, she could see planes taking off, carrying their passengers to destinations around the world. Business trips, family visits, romantic getaways, adventures. All the normal human experiences that were being stripped away from her life. One security protocol at a time. Harrison was speaking into a small radio device, confirming arrangements and updating his superiors on the situation. His words were coded and professional, but Camilla understood their meaning. The bird was back in its cage. The minutes crawled by like hours in the small airport room. Camilla sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain what dignity she could while Harrison and his team went about their business with military efficiency. Every few minutes, one of the officers would step outside to take a call or provide an update, leaving her feeling more isolated with each departure. She thought about the first time Charles had proposed to her. Years ago, before Diana, before the scandal, before everything became so complicated. They had been walking through the grounds of his country estate, discussing horses and literature, when he had suddenly stopped beside a centuries-old oak tree and told her he couldn't imagine his life without her in it. Back then, the proposal had felt romantic, full of possibility and love. She had said yes immediately, her heart full of joy at the thought of spending her life with the man she adored. But that was before she understood what accepting would truly mean. Before she learned that marrying the future king meant giving up herself entirely. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Harrison opened the door to admit a woman in a crisp navy suit carrying a clipboard and what appeared to be official documents. She introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell from the Palace Protocol Office, speaking in the same carefully neutral tone that all palace staff seemed to master. Mrs. Parker Bowles, I do hope you understand the concern your departure has caused, Sarah began, settling into a chair beside Harrison. When His Royal Highness was unable to reach you this morning for your scheduled call, he became quite worried. Scheduled call. Even their phone conversations were now scheduled events, regulated and timed like state meetings. Camilla remembered when Charles used to call her spontaneously, sometimes in the middle of the night just to tell her about a book he was reading, or a thought that had struck him during his official duties. I left word with Mrs. Henderson that I would be visiting family, Camilla replied quietly, referring to her longtime housekeeper. I didn't realize I needed to file a formal travel request. Sarah's smile was practiced and cold. Of course, under normal circumstances, family visits are wonderful. However, given the current security climate and your unique position, any international travel must be coordinated through proper channels. We simply cannot have the future Princess of Wales traveling without appropriate protection. The emphasis on future Princess of Wales felt like a chain being wrapped around her heart. Every time someone used that title, she felt a little more of her old self disappearing. Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman who could decide on a whim to visit her sister, was being systematically erased and replaced with this royal construct who required permission to leave the country. Perhaps we could arrange a proper family visit, Sarah continued, consulting her clipboard. With adequate security, of course. I'm sure your sister would understand the necessary precautions. Camilla almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Annabelle, who valued privacy above almost everything else, forced to accommodate a team of royal protection officers in her peaceful mountain retreat. The intimate sister time Camilla had craved would become another staged royal event, complete with security sweeps and communication protocols. That won't be necessary, Camilla said firmly. I believe the moment has passed. Through the window, she watched as the Swiss Airlines flight she should have been on began its taxi toward the runway. Her seat was empty now, probably reassigned to a standby passenger who would spend the next few hours flying toward the freedom she had been denied. Harrison received another radio communication, this one longer than the others. When he finished, he turned to Camilla with what might have been regret in his professional demeanor. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we've encountered a slight complication with your luggage inspection." Her heart sank further, though she hadn't thought it was possible. "What sort of complication?" "Well," Sarah consulted her clipboard again. "It appears you packed some items that require additional review. Personal letters, for instance, and several books that haven't been cleared by the Royal Library." "My books require clearance?" The question came out sharper than Camilla had intended, her composure finally beginning to crack. "Nothing dramatic, I assure you." Sarah's tone remained maddeningly calm. "Simply standard procedure. We need to ensure that any materials in your possession align with your public role and don't present any security concerns." Security concerns. Her collection of Jane Austen novels and the letters from her late father were apparently security concerns. The privacy she had once taken for granted was now seen as a potential threat to the monarchy. "How long will this inspection take?" Camilla asked, though she was beginning to understand that the delay was intentional. They were buying time until Charles could arrive to handle the situation personally. "Difficult to say," Harrison replied diplomatically. "These things have their own timeline." Outside the small window, Camilla watched as her flight disappeared into the clouds, carrying strangers toward the Swiss Alps where her sister was probably beginning to worry about her delayed arrival. She imagined Annabelle checking her phone, perhaps driving to the small airport in Zurich to meet a plane that would arrive without its most important passenger. The irony wasn't lost on her. In a few months she would have access to private jets, royal residences around the world, and unlimited resources for travel. But she would never again have the simple freedom to buy a commercial airline ticket and disappear for a week of sisterly comfort. Sarah was explaining something about revised protocols for future travel requests, but Camilla wasn't really listening anymore. She was thinking about the woman she used to be, the one who could make impulsive decisions and face whatever consequences arose. That woman was disappearing, one royal protocol at a time, and Camilla wasn't sure she had the strength to fight for her survival. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the air outside the airport window made Camilla's stomach tighten with dread. She didn't need to ask. She knew that distinctive sound meant Charles had arrived. Within minutes, the careful choreography of royal arrival would unfold, and her last hope of maintaining any dignity in this situation would evaporate. Sarah looked up from her clipboard with what might have been relief. His Royal Highness has arrived. This matter can now be resolved properly." Harrison was already speaking into his radio, coordinating the security arrangements that would allow the future king to enter the airport without creating a media circus. Through the window, Camilla could see additional vehicles arriving, the carefully orchestrated convoy that followed Charles everywhere he went. She closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for the conversation that was coming. Would he be angry? Disappointed? Or worse, would he speak to her in that carefully controlled royal voice he used when addressing the public, treating her like a subject rather than the woman he claimed to love? The door opened and Charles stepped inside, still wearing the country tweeds he favored during his Scottish tours. His hair was slightly disheveled from the helicopter ride, and there were lines of worry around his eyes that made him look older than his years. For a moment, he looked like the man she had fallen in love with rather than the heir to the throne. "Camilla," he said softly, and the genuine concern in his voice nearly broke her resolve to remain composed. Harrison and Sarah immediately stood, offering the small courtesies required in the presence of royalty. Charles acknowledged them with a brief nod but kept his attention focused entirely on Camilla. "Could we have some privacy, please?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question when spoken by the future king. The room cleared quickly, leaving them alone for the first time since this ordeal began. Charles took the chair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in a gesture that reminded her of their early conversations, when he would listen so intently to her thoughts about books, horses, and life. "What were you thinking?" he asked quietly, and there was hurt in his voice rather than anger. "I was thinking I needed to breathe," Camilla replied honestly. "I was thinking I needed a few days to remember who I am before I lose myself completely." Charles was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. She could see him processing her words, trying to understand how the woman he loved could feel so trapped by the life he was offering her. "You could have talked to me," he said finally. If you were feeling overwhelmed, we could have worked something out. Could we? She asked, and the weariness in her own voice surprised her. When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't scheduled by your private secretary? When did we last make a spontaneous decision together? When did you last call me just because you missed my voice? The questions hung in the air between them, and she watched understanding dawn in his eyes. He was beginning to see what she had been trying to tell him for months, that in gaining a future queen, he was losing the woman he had fallen in love with. The protocols are for your protection, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Charles, she said firmly. The protocols are for the crown's protection. I'm just collateral damage. He reached across the table and took her hands in his. They were warm and familiar. The hands that had once made her feel safe and cherished. Now they felt like beautiful shackles. I love you, he said simply. More than the crown, more than duty, more than any of it. Then why am I sitting in an airport detention room instead of flying to visit my sister? The question was direct and painful, and she could see him struggling with the answer. Because the truth was complicated. He did love her, but he also loved his destiny, his duty, his role as future king. And those two loves were constantly at war with each other. What can I do? He asked, and she heard genuine desperation in his voice. Tell me how to fix this. Camilla looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man she had loved for so many years. But she also saw the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on his shoulders, the impossibility of his position, the way duty had shaped every aspect of his life until personal desires became secondary considerations. Let me go to Switzerland, she said quietly. Just for a week. Let me have this one last taste of freedom before I become someone else forever. The security risks are minimal in a private chalet in the Swiss Alps, she interrupted. We both know this isn't about security, Charles. This is about control. He was quiet again, and she could see the battle playing out in his expression. Part of him wanted to grant her request, to give her this gift of temporary freedom. But the prince, the future king, the man trained from birth to put duty above personal desires, couldn't quite overcome a lifetime of conditioning. What if something happened to you? He asked. What if there was an accident or someone recognized you or... Then it would be my choice, she said firmly. My risk to take, my consequence to face. When did my own judgment about my own safety become irrelevant? Through the window, she could see the Swiss Airlines plane, now just a distant speck in the sky. Her sister would be worried by now, probably calling the airlines to check for delays or cancellations. She would never imagine that her sister was being held in an airport room, negotiating for basic human freedoms with the man she was supposed to marry. I don't know how to be both, Charles said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Both what? The man who loves you completely and the prince who has to protect the crown. They want different things, and I don't know how to reconcile them. For the first time since this ordeal began, Camilla felt a flicker of hope. Not for her freedom, that battle was already lost, but for their relationship. He was finally admitting the fundamental conflict that had been tearing them apart. The vulnerability in Charles's admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. For years their relationship had been built around the assumption that love would conquer all obstacles, that their feelings for each other would somehow overcome the massive institutional forces trying to shape their lives. But sitting in that sterile airport room, both of them were finally confronting the possibility that love might not be enough. Maybe, Camilla said carefully, we need to start being honest about what this marriage will really cost us. Charles looked up at her with surprise. Throughout their engagement, she had been the one reassuring him that she could handle the transition, that she was strong enough to become what the crown needed her to be. This was the first time she had openly acknowledged that the cost might be too high. What do you mean? He asked, though she suspected he already knew. I mean that I've been pretending I can become someone else without losing myself. I've been telling you I can handle the protocols, the restrictions, the constant scrutiny. But Charles, I can't even visit my sister without triggering a security alert and a helicopter rescue mission. She gestured around the small room, at the locked door, at the window that offered a view of freedom she couldn't reach. This is what my life will be like. Every decision filtered through a dozen advisors, every impulse checked against royal protocol, every human moment transformed into a security concern. Charles was quiet, but she could see him processing the reality of what she was describing. He had grown up in this world of restrictions and protocols. For him, the limitations were like breathing. so automatic he barely noticed them anymore. But watching her struggle against them was forcing him to see his life through different eyes. "There has to be a middle ground," he said finally. "Some way to balance your needs with the requirements of the position." "Is there?" she asked. "Name one spontaneous thing you've done in the past year. One decision you made without consulting your private secretary or considering the public relations implications." The question clearly caught him off guard. She watched him thinking, searching his memory for an example, and she could see the exact moment when he realized he couldn't find one. "That's different," he said weakly. "I've been trained for this since birth. And now you're asking me to accept that same prison but without the benefit of a lifetime of preparation." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Charles, I love you, but I don't know if I can love you enough to disappear entirely." A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Harrison's voice came through the wood, respectful but insistent. "Your Royal Highness, we have a situation developing with the media presence outside. Perhaps we should consider moving to a more secure location." Charles closed his eyes briefly, and Camilla could see the weight of duty settling back onto his shoulders. The private man who had been struggling with impossible choices was being replaced by the public figure who had to manage crises and maintain appearances. "Give us 5 more minutes," he called back, but they both knew the spell was broken. Reality was reasserting itself, demanding their attention, pulling them back into their assigned roles. "What happens now?" Camilla asked. "Now we go home," Charles said, but there was no satisfaction in his voice. "We'll work through this together. We'll find a way to make it work." "And my luggage? The books and letters that apparently require security clearance?" He looked uncomfortable. "The inspection is just a formality. Everything will be returned to you." But they both knew it wouldn't be the same. Her private letters from her father had been read by strangers, her book choices catalogued and analyzed. The boundaries around her personal life had been violated in the name of security and royal protection. "I want you to understand something," Camilla said, standing up for the first time in hours. "I'm going to come home with you today because I love you and because I gave you my word when I accepted your proposal. But I need you to understand what you're asking of me." Charles stood as well, and for a moment they faced each other across the small room like negotiators trying to work out the terms of a peace treaty. "I'm asking you to give up every vestige of personal autonomy," she continued. "Every private moment, every personal choice, every impulse toward independence. I'm asking myself to become a symbol instead of a person, a role instead of a woman." "That's not what I want," he said desperately. "But it's what you need," she replied sadly. "The crown needs it, the institution needs it, and you can't separate yourself from those needs anymore. You haven't been able to for years." Another knock, more insistent this time. The outside world was pressing in on them, demanding their attention, requiring them to step back into their public roles and leave their private struggles behind. "I love you enough to try," Camilla said finally. "But I need you to love me enough to see what you're asking." Charles nodded, but she could see in his eyes that he was already shifting back into prince mode, already calculating the public relations implications of her attempted flight, already planning how to manage the fallout from this very private crisis. As he moved toward the door to signal Harrison, Camilla took one last look out the window. The sky was empty now, all the departing flights having disappeared into the distance. But somewhere out there, her sister was waiting in the Swiss mountains, wondering what had happened to the visit that would never come. The door opened, and the machinery of royal life began to move again, sweeping them both up in its inexorable rhythm. But something fundamental had changed between them in that small room. They had finally spoken honestly about the cost of their love, and neither of them would ever be able to pretend again that the price wasn't devastating. The journey back to Clarence House passed in tense silence. Camilla sat in the back of the royal car, watching London blur past through bulletproof windows that made the world outside seem distant and unreal. Charles sat beside her, occasionally reaching for her hand, but each gesture felt more like an apology than a comfort. Harrison sat in the front passenger seat, speaking quietly into his radio about security arrangements and media management. She caught fragments of his conversation. Situation contained, minimal exposure, normal protocols resumed. Her failed escape attempt was already being reduced to bureaucratic language, filed away as another security incident to be managed and forgotten. When they arrived at Clarence House, Camilla was struck by how much the familiar building now felt like a beautiful prison. The elegant Georgian facade that had once welcomed her warmly now seemed to loom over her with institutional authority. Staff members who had once greeted her with genuine warmth now offered the careful smiles reserved for difficult members of the royal family. Mrs. Henderson, her longtime housekeeper, was waiting in the entrance hall with barely concealed concern. The older woman had worked for Camilla for over a decade, had seen her through her divorce, through the early years of her relationship with Charles, through all the private moments that had shaped her into the woman she was today. "Welcome home, ma'am," Mrs. Henderson said formally, but her eyes conveyed a different message entirely. The housekeeper had clearly been questioned about Camilla's departure plans, had probably been made to feel complicit in what the palace viewed as a security breach. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Camilla replied, trying to convey with her tone that she held no blame. "I trust everything has been well in my absence." It was a painfully formal exchange between two women who had once chatted comfortably about everything from garden planning to recipe modifications. But the presence of royal protection officers and palace staff made genuine conversation impossible. Charles guided her toward his private study, the room where they had spent so many happy hours discussing books and sharing quiet moments away from public duties. Now even this sanctuary felt different, contaminated by the institutional power that had followed them home from the airport. "I know today was difficult," he began once they were alone, "but I hope you can understand why it was necessary." Camilla settled into the familiar chair by the fireplace, but instead of comfort, she felt only the weight of surveillance. Even here, in what should have been their most private space, she was aware that their conversation might be monitored, their words recorded for security purposes or palace records. "Necessary for whom?" she asked quietly. "For us," Charles said, but the words sounded hollow. "For our future together." "Charles, do you remember when you used to tell me about your dreams? Not your royal duties or state obligations, but your actual dreams. The things you wanted to do if you could choose freely." He looked puzzled by the change of subject. "Of course, why? When was the last time you mentioned one of those dreams? When did you last talk about anything you wanted that wasn't connected to your royal role?" The question clearly unsettled him. She watched him search his memory, saw the moment when he realized that somewhere along the way, his personal desires had been completely absorbed into his public identity. "That's what's happening to me," she said gently. "Today at the airport wasn't really about visiting my sister. It was about holding on to the last piece of myself that hasn't been transformed into royal property." A soft knock interrupted them, and Charles's private secretary entered with the day's correspondence and a summary of the afternoon's scheduled events. Even in crisis, the machinery of royal life continued its relentless operation. "Sir, the palace has requested a briefing about today's incident," the secretary said tactfully, "and there are several calls regarding tomorrow's engagements that require your attention." Camilla watched Charles shift back into his official role, saw him compartmentalize their personal crisis so he could deal with state business. It was a skill he had developed over decades of royal training, but seeing it happen so seamlessly made her feel more isolated than ever. After the secretary left, Charles turned back to her with an expression that tried to bridge his two worlds. "We'll work through this," he said. "I promise you, we'll find a way to make this work for both of us." But Camilla was beginning to understand that the problem wasn't personal, it was structural. The institution of monarchy wasn't designed to accommodate individual needs or personal desires. It required complete submission to its requirements, and no amount of love could change that fundamental reality. "I've been thinking about something," she said carefully. "What if I'm not strong enough to be what you need me to be?" "You are strong enough," he said immediately. "You're the strongest person I know." "But what if strength isn't the issue?" she asked. "What if the problem is that I don't want to become someone else entirely?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to fully examine. Through the study windows, Camilla could see the palace gardens where she had once walked freely, planning their future together with such hope. Now those same paths would require security clearance. "I need to call Annabelle," she said suddenly. "She'll be worried sick." Charles nodded, but she could see him calculating even this simple request. A phone call to Switzerland would now require consideration of security protocols, international communications monitoring, and potential media implications. "Of course," he said. "Use my private line." Even her sister calls would now go through royal communication systems. Another small freedom surrendered to the machinery of state protection. As she dialed Annabelle's number, Camilla wondered how many such small surrenders it would take before nothing of her original self remained. Camilla? Annabelle's voice was tight with worry. What happened? Your flight never arrived, and when I called the airline, they said you never boarded. I'm sorry, Camilla said, acutely aware that Charles was listening to every word. Something came up. A security concern. Security concern? Annabelle's voice rose. What kind of security concern requires missing a family visit? Camilla looked at Charles, seeing in his expression the careful calculation that had become second nature to him. How much truth could be shared? How much honesty was safe? The kind that comes with my new life, Camilla said quietly. I'm afraid spontaneous visits may not be possible anymore. The silence on the other end of the line was heartbreaking. Annabelle was beginning to understand that her sister was slipping away into a world where even family relationships had to be filtered through institutional requirements. I see, Annabelle said finally. Well, perhaps you can visit when it's more convenient for your situation. After the call ended, Camilla and Charles sat in silence, both of them processing what they had just heard. The sadness in Annabelle's voice, the careful distance she had immediately placed between them, the recognition that their sisterly relationship was now subject to royal approval. This is what it will be like, Camilla said softly. Every relationship, every connection, every piece of my old life will have to be renegotiated through palace protocol. Charles reached for her hand again, but this time she pulled away gently. She needed to think clearly, and his touch carried too much history, too much emotion to allow for rational thought. I love you, she said, looking directly at him, but I'm beginning to understand that love isn't enough to bridge the gap between who I am and who you need me to become. Don't say that, he said desperately. We can make this work. People adapt to new circumstances all the time. Do they? She asked. Or do they just learn to hide the parts of themselves that don't fit? As evening shadows began to fall across the study, Camilla realized that her failed escape attempt had accomplished something unexpected. It had forced both of them to confront the true cost of their love, not just for her, but for him as well. 3 weeks later, Camilla stood in the same study at Clarence's house, but everything had changed. The room looked identical. The same books on the shelves, the same comfortable chairs, the same view of the manicured gardens. But the woman who occupied the space was fundamentally different. From the one who had been escorted, back from Heathrow Airport, she had made her decision during those long days of reflection that followed her thwarted escape. Not a decision born of anger or rebellion, but one that emerged from a deep understanding of what love truly meant, and what it could not accomplish. Charles sat across from her, his face grave with the knowledge of what was coming. They had been circling around this conversation for weeks, both of them recognizing its inevitability, but reluctant to give voice to the truth they had discovered. I've been thinking about what you said at the airport, Camilla began quietly, about not knowing how to be both the man who loves me and the prince who serves the crown. He nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Over the past weeks, he had watched her grow more distant, not out of anger, but out of a kind of protective withdrawal. She was preparing herself for something, and he suspected he knew what it was. I realize now that I've been asking you to make an impossible choice, she continued, and in doing so, I've been making an impossible choice myself. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Henderson tending to the rose garden, the same roses Camilla had helped plant during the early, hopeful days of their engagement. The older woman had been unusually gentle with her these past weeks, bringing tea without being asked, lingering for small conversations that felt like a form of comfort. The woman you fell in love with, Camilla said carefully, was someone who could make spontaneous decisions, who could call her sister on a whim and book a flight to Switzerland, who could read whatever book she chose without security clearance. That woman is disappearing piece by piece, and I don't think either of us wants to see what's left when the transformation is complete. We can find compromises, Charles said, but his voice lacked conviction. We can work within the system to preserve what matters most, can we? She asked gently. What spontaneous decision have you made in the past 20 years? What part of your authentic self have you managed to preserve intact within the system? The question hung between them, unanswerable because they both knew the truth. The institution of monarchy was designed to subsume individual identity entirely. It required nothing less than complete surrender of personal autonomy, and no amount of love could change that fundamental reality. "I've been thinking about Diana," Camilla said softly, and she saw Charles flinch at the name. Not with jealousy or comparison, but with understanding. She tried to find a way to be both herself and what the crown needed. "And we all saw how that ended." "That was different," he protested. "Diana was young, unprepared." "Diana was human," Camilla interrupted gently. "Just as I am human. And the institution doesn't accommodate humanity very well, does it?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gardens where they had once walked together, planning a future that now seemed impossibly naive. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you too much to watch you torn apart by competing loyalties. And I love myself too much to disappear entirely into a role that requires me to give up everything that makes me who I am." She had rehearsed these words for days, but speaking them aloud still felt like tearing her heart in half. The man sitting across from her was the love of her life, the person she had imagined growing old with, sharing quiet evenings and gentle conversations about books and horses and all the small things that had first brought them together. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "We've overcome so much already. The scandal, the public disapproval, all of it. We can overcome this too." "Charles," she said gently, "this isn't something to overcome. This is the fundamental nature of what you're offering me. A life where every decision is made by committee, every impulse filtered through institutional requirements, every human moment transformed into a security concern." She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the world beyond the palace walls. Somewhere out there, people were making spontaneous plans, booking flights, visiting family without security clearances, living the kind of ordinary, unmonitored lives that had once seemed so natural she never questioned them. "I want you to be happy," she said, turning back to face him. "I want you to serve your country and fulfill your destiny as king. But I can't be the person standing beside you if it means ceasing to exist as myself." Charles rose from his chair and crossed to her, taking her hands in his one last time. His touch was warm and familiar, carrying the memory of all their years together, all the moments when love had felt strong enough to conquer any obstacle. "What will you do?" he asked. "I'll go back to my old life," she said simply. "I'll visit my sister when I want to, read books that haven't been approved by royal librarians, and make decisions based on my own judgment rather than institutional requirements." "And us?" She looked into his eyes, seeing the man she had loved alongside the prince he had always been. "We'll always have what we had," she said softly. "The love was real, Charles. It just wasn't enough to bridge the gap between two incompatible worlds." As the sun set over London, casting long shadows across the study where they had shared so many private moments, both of them understood that some love stories don't end with weddings and crowns. Sometimes the most loving thing two people can do is acknowledge that their worlds are too different to merge without destroying what made them fall in love in the first place. The following morning, the official announcement would speak of mutual agreement and amicable separation. But sitting in that quiet study as evening fell, they both knew the truth was far more complex and infinitely more heartbreaking. They had discovered that love, however deep and genuine, could not always overcome the fundamental incompatibilities between freedom and duty, between authentic self and institutional role. Camilla would return to her cottage in the countryside, to her books and her horses and her ability to make spontaneous decisions. Charles would continue his journey toward the throne, carrying with him the memory of a love that was real but impossible. And somewhere in Switzerland, Annabelle would receive a phone call from her sister making plans for a long overdue visit that would require no security clearance at all.